Hello everyone, it's Adelina for Ellen Hudson. Today I'm showing a process video for creating a travel watercolor set. I'll share how I assembled my watercolor set, and then I'll show you some techniques for using watercolor in the Canva bullet journal. I'll discuss a few of the pros and cons. To begin, let's create our travel watercolor set. For today's project, I started with empty watercolor pans. These pans come in full and half size. They're pictured here. The other supplies I'm using today are Kuretake water brushes, watercolor paint brushes by Ranger, a paper trimmer, and a magnet sheet that I've backed with some stick-it adhesive. I'll be using the Daniel Smith watercolor essential set for today's project. And these watercolors come in tubes, and what I did is transfer the watercolor from the tubes to the empty watercolor pans that I bought, and then I left them out overnight to dry. After about 12 hours of drying out in the open overnight, they were the right consistency. When I held them on their side, they weren't pouring out, and that's what you want. And so each of those tubes fills a full pan and a half pan. And they're going to be housed in this empty Altoid tin. And so what I didn't want to happen is when I arranged those in the tin, I didn't want them moving around. So I took that magnetic sheet and cut it in strips that were just a little bit less than 3/4 of an inch wide. And I adhered them to the underside of those watercolor pans so that when I arranged them in my Altoid tin, they wouldn't move around. So here I am putting them in the configuration that I want to, and you'll see when I shake those around, close the lid, they're not going anywhere, and that's exactly what I want. So that makes it much easier to toss into a bag and travel with. And so you can do these in a variety of configurations. I am showing some full pan and half pan options. Now I used all the same colors for some of my half pans, so you see me pulling some other colors off to the side. But I just think that this works really great to keep your watercolors right where you want them. It's really nice to have swatches of the watercolors that you're storing because they look differently on paper than they do in the pans. So I've created a PDF template that you can download from the Ellen Hudson blog. Of a few different watercolor full and half pan layouts that you can print for use with your travel palette. So if you have a We Are Memory Keepers corner chomper, you can round the corners of this printout using the half inch radius side. That's what I've done here. And so to swatch my palette, I've used my water brush and gently swatch the color on my printout, and I printed my swatch template on some 80-pound cardstock. And so you'll see me here going through this process of just cleaning the brush on an old rag and then swatching the watercolor on the template. So once I had my swatches completed, I didn't want my swatch moving around. So I took another piece of that magnetic sheet and adhered it to the back and stuck that in the Altoid tin, and now everything's staying put. So here we have a completed photo of my travel kit. So now let's talk about using watercolor in the Canva bullet journal. So the paper in the Canva is really thick, but it is not watercolor paper. So a couple of things to bear in mind when you are using watercolor on paper that's not meant to be used for watercolor. If you go over the surface of that paper several times with water, it's going to start to break down the surface of the paper. So what I'm doing here is just taking a little bit of that watercolor and I'm just patting it on top of the paper. You don't see me running my brush across the surface of it. Now this is still going to change the surface of the paper, but it's not going to start to break it down. You're not going to start to have that paper pilling up on that surface. That's what I was trying to avoid. And so here, because this is a March layout in, I wanted to have a St. Patrick's Day feel. I did a rainbow layout. And so I'm just dabbing the top of that paper gently with the watercolor. The paper is going to warp, and that's just going to happen. And so it's not a big deal. It's not a ton of warping that happens, but if you do this technique and you see it warping, that's totally normal. And since I'm just tapping that watercolor on top of that paper, from the time I started this project and by the time I got to that last column, the first column had already dried. So it dries fairly quickly. Another technique that I like to use when using watercolor in the Canva is just splattering paint. And so here you see me taking the Ranger watercolor brush, and I have a bowl of clean water and a bowl of dirty water. And so I'm cleaning my colors in the dirty water bowl, and then I'm just wetting my brush in that bowl with the clean water and combining my colors as needed to create the color that I wanted to splash. So as you watch me complete this layout, let's talk a little bit about the pros and cons of doing watercolor in the Canva bullet journal. I honestly didn't have any cons to doing watercolor in this journal. I mean, aside from the fact that the paper is not meant for watercolor, it really reacted the way I expected it to. So anytime you add water to non-watercolor paper, it's going to warp, it'll change the surface texture, and you just have to approach it gingerly when you're using a paintbrush on it. The pros are that I didn't experience any bleeding or ghosting on the back side of this page. Even after I did the watercolor and went over my penciled in lines with ink, it didn't show through to the other side. There was some slight warping of the paper, but nothing that would really affect doing a layout on the back side of this page. So I really like that about this journal. If the Canva bullet journal isn't your medium of choice, you can use some heavyweight cardstock and apply these same techniques to card making. I hope today's video inspires you to make a watercolor travel kit of your own and maybe try some of these techniques. The blog details and product details for this project can be found in the description below. If you like this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. Thanks for watching and have a great day.